At The Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
When becoming a doctor, there's a lot of rites of passage. Dissecting a cadaver in an anatomy lab, the first time you break bad news to a patient. But the one that takes the cake, the one regarded with the most dread, is being code leader. I'm Emily Silverman, and this is The Nocturnist, stories about what it's like to work in medicine. In this episode, we talk with Grant Smith, chief resident in internal medicine at UCSF, who plans to go into palliative care. Grant walks us through his first experience as code leader, and afterward, we talk about the anatomy of a code and different ways of dying in the hospital. I give you Grant Smith.
Hi. So for me, one of the hardest things about being a resident is that we often have to do a lot of things for the first time. And I know that a lot of people our age are doing things for the first time in their jobs, and doing things for the first time is a part of any new job. But I always felt like our first time things are often, why am I doing this and what am I doing? I think some of the things that come to mind is, oh, hey, do you want to stick a needle in this person's back? Yeah, it's going to go right by the spinal cord, but it's no big deal. We're just going to get a little fluid out. Like, that is crazy. Other things that come to mind, the first time you have to sit down and tell someone, I'm really sorry. I'm really worried that you only have days to weeks left to live. This is crazy stuff. Like, this is not normal. My biggest reflection on this is when I tell these stories to my brother, who's not in medicine. And he's always like, wait, they let you do what? Please never take me to a teaching hospital. I never want to go there. It sounds terrible. I think like a lot of residents, one of those first that I was most nervous about was having to lead a code. And most of you in the audience know that a code is when a patient's heart stops, they start breathing, or they just look so terrible that people think that they're going to die. And they announce these things overhead on the intercom over the hospital. A whole team of people run. And as the code leader, it is your job to run this show. So it can be very intimidating. So as I was thinking about the first time I have to run a code, it was when I would be at the VA on wards. And most days of the week, not the second-year resident running the code. It's normally someone from the ICU team. But on Thursdays, those people just aren't there. So it's your job. That's fine, whatever. In my mind, as I'm getting ready for this, I know this is coming. It starts like creeping into my head at random times. So I remember one time I was out running at Land's End, and I was overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge and the ocean, and I was like imagining going up and being like, my name is Grant Smith, I'm the co-leader, and just like fantasizing I was just gonna like boss this so hard. But fast forward to like the night before starting VA, I've got like my code cards, I've got my code script, I'm like going over it in my mind, and I'm feeling like, okay, I kind of know what I'm gonna do, but there still is this like pit in your stomach that is like, oh my gosh, like, do I know enough? Like, am I gonna be able to act fast enough? And like, am I enough to do this job? So, second night on call, it's 2 a.m., and overhead, code blue, ICU. Code blue, ICU. I don't know why the voice is like trying to be so calm, but it's terrible. And at that moment, I was like, this is like being on a flight and having the oxygen mask come down. It's like, you know it could happen, you like kind of remember what the lady told you to do with it. But you're still like, oh fuck. So, okay, the sirens are going off, my pager's going off, I get up, put on my white coat, I've got like my code cards in, I've got my pocket in, I've got everything that I need, and I start running, trying to do the stethoscope hold, card thing hold. I'm running, okay, we're gonna do the code. Where the fuck is the VA ICU? I've never been, I don't know. I'm like, well, it's not on the first floor. Okay, second floor. ICU, no, okay. I bust into the wards on the second floor. I see a nurse like 20 yards down. Nurse, where's the ICU? Okay, third floor, okay, thank you! Okay, and I'm going. I get to the ICU, and I don't know why or where it came from, but I just raised my hand, because that's what I felt like I needed to do. Before I even look at the patient, my name is Grant Smith, I'm the co-leader, does the patient have a pulse? What is their code status? The patient responds, I'm fine. Okay, let's get a backboard on. We need to get the pads on. We can get them on the monitor. What is this IV access? Are we going to start some fluids? Let's get it going. Where's the pharmacist? I was just, terrified. The nurses look at me like, who is this crazy resident and what is he doing? I'm, trying to figure out what's going on. The code pharmacist is like, can I go? I was like, no, you may not. And I get the story. It sounds like basically the nurses had got him up to walk at 2 a.m., and he basically almost fainted. But I'm sitting there talking about it, and okay, what's going on? And all of a sudden, the mood in the room changes. And I realize that the nurses are looking at me like, okay, doc, so what's next? And I think at that moment, it was a turning point for me. I realized, you know what? I'm doing it. I do know enough. I am acting fast enough. And I am enough. Thank you for listening to my story.
Hi, Grant.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Thanks for coming over.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to see you. I'm really excited to talk about your story because it has been one of the most loved stories of any Nocturnus event.
Oh.
But before we get into it, I wanted to ask you a question that I ask most people when they come over.
Okay.
I would like to know a little bit about your journey to medicine.
Okay. Well, I guess I sort of became interested in college. I wasn't really sure, kind of one of those people who was sort of pre-med-ish going in, interested in science, wanted to help people.
Whatever that means.
Yeah. And then maybe I can tell you a few experiences that sort of led me there. So I did this volunteering program. I went to Duke for undergrad. So I was at Duke Hospital. And it was your job was just to go and meet with patients and sit with them, hang out with them, get them a magazine if they wanted. It was very chill, I guess. And now looking back though, I realized I was 19 at the time, which is very young. I remember this one day I went into this patient's room. She's a young woman from rural North Carolina. And I don't know anything about the medical stuff going on with her, but I remember sitting on her bed and she was telling me how it was really hard because her family couldn't visit because either they didn't have a car, it was too much to come, or I forget the details. But I remember I was there and this doctor walked in, hand on the door the whole time. It was oh, your labs came back. They don't look good, but I guess you're busy. I'll come back later. And then walked out and shut the door. And then this woman who I have no idea what was wrong with her, though, burst into tears. I was I'm 19. I don't know what to do with this.
Oh.
And that was one experience where I thought a lot oh wow, I may not be someone who could be a great doctor, but maybe I could do better than that dude.
Totally.
And I don't know. So that was a time where I was sort of more interested in medicine, and I don't know. I thought that maybe I could have a role in making medicine a little bit better. And then maybe another big experience, which is maybe not as much medicine, but even my particular interest in medicine, was in college. I took this sociology course called Death and Dying, which is a lot for an undergrad course. And I took it just check off all the boxes on to graduate. But it was very profound for me. And in the class, we learned just about a lot of random things, including a book on the mortuary business. We read some of the early, or the mid-90s studies, the support studies that were some of the first big studies about dying in America and how low quality that experience was for people. And I think for me, it just sort of blew the lid off this sort of taboo topic of dying, which I hadn't really thought of much. I felt was definitely taboo in the country. I'm from the South, pretty taboo in my own family and the area. And it just sort of was crazy to me that this is something we know is going to happen to every single person. We don't talk about it, and we're really bad at it. So how have we not addressed this issue more? Mm-hmm. So that kind of got me interested in palliative care, end of life care, or at least that concept. I didn't know probably what palliative care was at the time.
Yeah, wow. So your interest in palliative care dates back pretty early, actually.
Yeah, it's a little bit weird.
It's interesting because I feel like most people turn to palliative care once they're in residency and they realize that the palliative care doctors are the ones with the time to actually sit down and talk to the patient and hear their story. But
yeah,
you were in on it early, I guess.
Yeah, and I think I went to med school and then learned that there was this thing called palliative care, and then met some of the people who were doing it and just thought, oh my God, like these are the doctors I've always wanted to be. Like that's what I always thought being a doctor was like talking to people, figuring out what they wanted, helping them get what they wanted.
I think that's a good segue actually into talking a little bit about your story, because part of being a doctor is dealing with death.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways that people die in the hospital is through what we call a code.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of our audience who don't know what a code is, can you briefly explain it?
Yeah. So a code is like a medical emergency, I guess, would maybe be the most basic way to say. A code can be called for many different reasons. I think the most like dreaded cause of a code is when someone's like, they don't have a pulse. And that's either because their heart is not beating at all, or it's not beating effectively enough to pump blood around their body. So that's like the most concerning cause of a code being called, although they can, again, as I said, sort of be called for many different reasons. But it is an emergency, people go running, and the goal is like bring the person back to life, basically, who is functionally like not alive right now.
I think to round out the picture, it would be good to explain to the audience that there's actually a blue button in every single room in the hospital. And if you want to call a code, whether you're the doctor or the nurse or the person who is changing the sheets, if something looks amiss, the attitude is hit the code blue button. And if it's a false alarm, no worries. Better to be safe than sorry.
Yeah, that's a great, and can be called sort of for really any reason where you just need more help is sort of what we tell people in our training program. They're like, if you think you need more help and need more people, just call a code and people will come.
Right.
Running, but they'll come.
People will come and they'll run and they'll all pile into this room and it'll be really chaotic. I guess that does bring me to my next question. You talk about how when you're a doctor in training, there are a lot of firsts.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the first time that you do a procedure called a lumbar puncture where you're sticking a needle in somebody's back to take out fluid, and that's wild. Or the first time that you're sitting down with somebody to tell them that they have cancer, for example, and how these are all really formative experiences. And yet, when it came time for you to choose a story to tell, you chose to tell a story about your first code. So tell me a little bit about why you chose that of all things.
Well, I think it's something that most people dread in residency, that it's super scary. And it does feel like something that you cannot get perfect training for. I think our program has done a good job of trying to do as best they can, as much as they can. And I very much appreciate that. But it's one of those things that like until you're like doing it, the full like force and emotion of it is hard to prepare for, I guess. And then I think it was just such like a funny juxtaposition of like being so scared and so nervous, and then it's like, oh my gosh, it's happening, and being like so caught up in the moment. And then it's like one of these where like essentially like the button was like pressed inadvertently. I mean, not fully. They were worried about the person, but they were okay.
Sort of a false alarm.
Yeah.
I was thinking about fear in human beings, and there's that running joke that the only thing people are afraid of more than death is public speaking. And I think that might play into a little bit why people are so afraid of running codes, because it feels like a skill that is more performative, like being on stage, like public speaking in a sense, as opposed to some of these other tasks which are really emotionally heavy, but are more private and contained. And so I think it's really a good pickup that is one of the most common fears among residents. How do you counsel residents on the anxieties and fears around their first code?
I think one is to normalize that it's very hard. It's a very complex cognitive task. And I think emotionally it can be a very hard task too, to be in this like very heightened, hyper acute situation. The patient's in a rough place. Like by many measures and definitions, the patient has died, and we are trying to like bring them back to life. Like we are really at medicine's like limitations of what it can do. So try to counsel people not to be too wrapped into the outcome. Like we know, like the data shows that, right? Like not a lot of people survive in hospital codes. So it's like should not be super surprising that a patient may not survive a code. Although we certainly hope that that is always the case when we're doing it. And then I think debriefing is super important. So most of the codes that I've been to, like been a part of or led, we really tried to debrief at the end to talk with the nurses, with the respiratory therapists, anyone who was there, like how did that go and how's everyone doing, and do a check-in. So I think there's a little bit of both like preparation and then also debriefing and like setting you up for success for like the next one too. And we also have a culture of having what we call a code whisperer, which is kind of like your backup person. They can be sort of like a second person just to help exactly what it says, like whisper in your ear to give you advice. And that's really nice too, because I think that almost always happened when I was leading a code. I've been the code whisperer for people, and it's just like you've got a buddy. So you're not doing this all on your own.
There's something about that that's really nice. And I remember for one of my first codes, I had an amazing code whisperer who was going into cardiology and had done many, many codes in the past. And this was one of my first codes, and he just whispered into my ear, check the potassium. It's called Code Whisperer for a reason. They're literally whispering to you what to do. And it's really nice to have that. So we're talking about codes, and that's one way for patients to die in the hospital, unfortunately. But then there's also other ways to die that are more prolonged and drawn out. As a palliative care physician, how do you think about deaths that culminate in this abrupt, patient loses a pulse, patient is coded, 20 minutes go by and that's it, versus more of the slow dwindling that can happen with chronic disease? What sorts of things do you notice about the differences in those two types of death?
Yeah. So I'll answer this like from a very like personal perspective, that I think the way I think about and conceptualize like how did that person's death go is really framed by like how the patient and their family and what their expectations were and how they were thinking about their death. So for example, I really think like at this very early stage and not even having done palliative care training yet, I do think that I want to be open to the idea that some people need to die like fighting as hard as they can, and that is part of like who they are and what they want. And that might mean going through a code where it's like a lot of intervention. I think doctors worry a lot that patients experience a lot of pain during that. I think, if I know that that's something that was really important to the patient and their family, to like have everything tried and like living as long as possible was their number one goal, then that is an easier pill to swallow, knowing that we probably put that person through an awful lot to try to give them that goal. As opposed to it's much harder when you either aren't sure or you're worried that no one really knows what the person wants, or you think that the patient like wouldn't want this, and you're somehow in a situation where you feel like you still need to perform like all these potentially life-saving interventions that may or may not be that helpful. And then that's much more conflicted for me as a doctor, being like, oh my gosh, like, is this really beneficial or not? So I think maybe I'll just try to summarize my answer, and that it really depends a lot on what the patient, what the family is sort of bringing to the table to their end of life experience, and what you know about what they want and what's valuable to them.
It seems like the most important thing is that what happens matches what the patient and family want to happen. And if the patient and the family want a code to be the last day because it's important to them that the patient undergo CPR, no matter what the prediction is of the survival rate or the outcome, then we can feel better about doing that. And likewise, if somebody says, I do not want CPR, I want to go peacefully without, having that kind of violent act, that we align with that. And as long as both of those are matched, then we can feel pretty good about it. But it seems like what you're saying is where the discomfort or the conflict happens is when there's a mismatch.
Yeah, certainly when there's a mismatch, it is most clearly a challenge and difficult. And I'd say even like maybe absolutely, there are probably extremes on both ends where it's very difficult to do certain interventions, like when someone is so sick and so unlikely to benefit, regardless of what the goals and values are. I'd say I personally haven't like totally figured out how I will practice yet in that. I need to like sort of see and learn from mentors a little bit more about that.
It's tricky. It's really hard to know when you have infinite tools at your disposal, medical tools, artificial life prolonging tools. It's difficult to know what to do when you have all of that in your toolkit.
Yeah.
How to refrain or restrain yourself and how to manage expectations. I wanted to talk a little bit about something that you mentioned in your story.
Mm-hmm.
So you say that you were talking to your brother about being in residency, being in training, and all of the things that you were learning to do and expected to do sometimes for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And your brother's reaction was, never send me to a teaching hospital. What would you say to your brother about that?
I would say that there are a lot of benefits. It's hard. Like I've never worked in a non-teaching hospital. Like I've always been in training to this point. So, I think that we think very carefully about our patients. I think the teams I've worked on, like we think a lot and spend a lot of time, and there is like a lot of overlap that I think is good for patients. There's probably some inefficiencies that are built into the system, but I don't think that means necessarily that patients get like a lot worse care by any means. And in some ways, I think they probably get really good care because they're being taken care of many people who are thinking about what's going on with them.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming in, Grant. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I hope that any residents out there who are feeling anxious about leading their first code know that you are in good company and everything will be fine.
It's good company, but thanks for that.
All right. Take care. That was the wonderful Grant Smith. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please subscribe and share with your friends, family, and colleagues. I also want to announce an event we have coming up here in San Francisco on Friday, April 20th on the theme of death and dying. It's being produced in partnership with Reimagine, a citywide conversation about living and dying through art, experience, and design. Check out our website for more details at www.thenocturnist.com. I want to thank executive producer Allie Block, podcast producer Marina Poole, Celine Ross, and Stephanie Muscat. Our music is from Yosef Monroe and Blue Dot Sessions. See you next time.